Flora giggled as her father spun her around in the wide, sunny yard of their sprawling estate. The warm light reflected off the golden leaves of the nearby trees, making everything feel magical. Life at the Barrett mansion was filled with joy, love, and everything a little girl could dream of. Flora's mother, dressed in an elegant cream sundress, called them in for tea, her laughter echoing across the manicured lawn. At just 4 years old, Flora was the heart of their world. She was bright, curious, and imaginative with an uncanny knack for storytelling. Every night she would sit cross-legged on her soft pink bed, her green eyes wide with wonder as she recounted her adventures to her parents. But there was one story Flora loved most, a story about her friend Elijah. "Elijah says I'll grow up to be very brave," she told her mother one evening, tugging at the silk ribbon of her nightgown. Her mother, brushing Flora's long chestnut hair, smiled warmly. "And who is Elijah, sweetheart?" Flora turned, her face lighting up. "He's the boy who visits me at night. He stands by my window and talks to me. He's so nice, Mama. He says I remind him of someone he used to know." Mrs. Barrett exchanged a look with her husband, who sat nearby reading the newspaper. "An imaginary friend," he said lightly, giving his wife a reassuring glance. "It's normal at her age." But Elijah wasn't imaginary, not to Flora. He had soft, dark hair, kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a voice that made her feel safe. He told her stories of faraway places and a time she didn't understand. When the nights felt too quiet, Elijah's whispers made her feel less alone. As the years passed, Flora continued to speak of Elijah. He became more than just a nighttime visitor. He was her confidant and protector. When she scraped her knee running through the garden, she heard his soft voice tell her she'd be all right. When thunder rolled through the night, she felt the brush of his hand on her shoulder, even though no one else saw him. But not everyone was as enchanted by Elijah as Flora was. At her 6th birthday party, Flora excitedly told her friends about her nightly talks with him. "He says he used to live in a house just like mine," she declared, her voice brimming with excitement. Her friends stared at her, confused. "You mean like a ghost?" one boy asked, wrinkling his nose. Flora shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, Elijah isn't scary. He's my friend." The group of children laughed, some nervously, others cruelly. A girl whispered, "Flora's weird," loud enough for her to hear. That night, Flora sat on her bed, her cheeks wet with tears. "Why don't they believe me, Elijah?" she whispered. Elijah's voice came softly, carried by the breeze from the open window. "Not everyone can see what's real, Flora. But I see you and I believe in you." His words comforted her in a way no one else could. By the time Flora turned 8, her parents grew concerned. Teachers called, saying Flora often spoke to someone who wasn't there during class. Her peers avoided her and birthday invitations stopped coming. One day her mother gently asked, "Flora, do you still see Elijah?" "Yes," Flora replied confidently. "He's with me every day." Mrs. Barrett's face softened with worry. "Honey, sometimes our minds play tricks on us. Maybe Elijah is just a dream." Flora shook her head. "He's not a dream, Mama. He's real." Unable to convince her otherwise, her parents decided to let her grow out of it. After all, she was still their bright, spirited girl, no matter how peculiar her stories seemed. But Flora knew the truth. Elijah wasn't a figment of her imagination. He was as real to her as the soft cashmere blankets on her bed or the crystal chandelier hanging in the dining room. And though the world around her doubted, Flora held on to her truth with unwavering determination. One crisp autumn evening, Flora sat by her bedroom window, gazing out at the twinkling city lights in the distance. She whispered, "Elijah, why can't anyone else see you?" Elijah appeared beside her, his form faint but familiar. His voice was filled with a quiet sadness. "I don't know, Flora. Maybe they aren't meant to." "Will you always stay with me?" she asked, her voice small. He hesitated, then smiled. "As long as you need me, I'll be here." For a child, those words were enough. Flora didn't understand why Elijah was different, why no one else could see him, or why he spoke of things that felt both distant and strangely familiar. All she knew was that Elijah was her friend, her protector, and the one who made her feel whole in a world that often felt confusing and cold. For now, that was all she needed. By the time Flora entered her teenage years, the warmth of her childhood began to cool. The lavish Barrett estate, with its sprawling gardens and glittering chandeliers, remained as grand as ever, but Flora's world felt smaller. The laughter of friends was gone, replaced by whispers behind her back. "She talks to ghosts," a boy muttered in the school hallway. "She's crazy," a girl added with a giggle. Flora kept her head down, clutching her books as she walked past them. She had tried to make friends, but every attempt seemed to end in disappointment. The moment she opened up about Elijah, people grew uncomfortable or outright mocked her. Eventually she stopped trying. Elijah, however, was always there. "You don't need them," he said one evening as she sat in her bedroom, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror on her dresser. "They don't understand you like I do. I wish they could see you," Flora whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe then they'd believe me." Elijah's presence filled the room like a warm embrace. "You don't need their belief, Flora. You have me." Her parents, too, had grown distant on the subject of Elijah. Her mother avoided bringing it up altogether, and her father dismissed it as a phase. "She'll grow out of it," he told her mother one evening, unaware that Flora was listening from the top of the grand staircase. But Flora didn't grow out of it. If anything, her bond with Elijah deepened. He became her sanctuary, the one she could turn to when the world felt unbearable. One day, during lunch at her private school, Flora overheard a group of girls talking about her. "She's so weird," one said, twirling a lock of her perfectly styled hair. "She told Mrs. Pruitt she has a ghost boyfriend. Can you imagine?" Flora's cheeks burned as she tightened her grip on her tray. She wanted to say something to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Elijah's voice came later that evening, soft and steady. "You're stronger than they are, Flora. They laugh because they don't understand. But it hurts," Flora admitted, her voice breaking. "Why can't I just be normal?" "Normal is overrated," Elijah said, his tone laced with humor. Despite his comforting words, loneliness became a constant companion. Flora spent her days reading in the grand library, her evenings walking the quiet halls of the estate, and her nights talking to Elijah. He told her stories of places she'd never been and people she'd never met, weaving a tapestry of memories that felt strangely like her own. As she grew older, Flora began to question Elijah's nature. "Who are you really?" she asked one night as she lay in bed, staring at the ornate ceiling. "I'm someone who is lost," he said after a long pause. "And I think I found you for a reason." "What reason?" "To remind me what it means to love," he replied softly. The words stayed with Flora, filling her heart with a mixture of warmth and sorrow. She didn't fully understand what Elijah meant, but she knew his presence in her life was more than chance. When Flora turned 18, she decided to stop sharing her truth with the world. The ridicule, the whispers, the stares, they weren't worth it. Instead, she focused on her studies, pouring her energy into books and art. She excelled academically, graduating at the top of her class and earning a scholarship to a prestigious university. But even as she stepped into adulthood, Elijah remained. Her parents were proud of her accomplishments, but they worried about her isolation. At family gatherings, they nudged her to socialize. "You should meet new people," her mother said one evening. "Go on dates. Have fun." Flora forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mama." But deep down she knew the truth. She didn't want anyone else. Elijah was the only one who truly saw her, who understood her in ways no one else could. One summer evening, as Flora sat on the balcony overlooking the estate gardens, Elijah's voice came to her, carried by the gentle breeze. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked. "All the time," Flora replied. "But it feels uncertain." Elijah appeared beside her, his form faint but steady. "What if I told you we could make it certain?" Flora turned to him, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze distant. "Flora, I've been by your side since you were a child. I've watched you grow, seen your strength, your kindness. You've given me a reason to exist in this strange half-world I'm trapped in." "Elijah, I love you, Flora," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And I want to be with you. Always." Tears filled Flora's eyes as her heart swelled with emotion. "I love you too," she whispered. That night, as the stars shone brightly above, Elijah made a promise. "No matter what happens, I'll never leave you." For Flora, the world's doubts and judgments faded into the background. She had found her truth, her anchor, her love. And nothing else mattered. As Flora entered her 20s, she became more attuned to the quiet strength within her. The ridicule of her youth faded into the background, replaced by a quiet resolve. Flora knew who she was, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to explain herself to anyone. She moved away from the Barrett estate to attend university, a luxurious building nestled in the heart of the city, with grand marble halls and sweeping views of the skyline. The students there were sophisticated, driven, and full of dreams. For the first time, Flora was surrounded by people who didn't care about the whispers of her past. They saw her as a bright young woman with potential. But in the midst of the bustling world, Flora felt more alone than ever. During the day she was a top student, excelling in her courses and impressing her professors with her sharp intellect. She was charming, friendly, and poised, but inside she felt like a stranger in a world she couldn't quite belong to. And every night when the lights of the city below twinkled like stars, Elijah was there. "I've missed you," Flora whispered one evening as she stood by her window, looking out over the city's glowing skyline. "I don't know how I can keep doing this without you." Elijah's soft voice answered as it always did, comforting and familiar. "You're stronger than you think, Flora. I'm always here even if you can't see me." But Flora's heart was heavy. The life she was living felt like a charade, one where she played the role of a normal student, a happy young woman, while her heart belonged to a ghost. At night as she lay in her bed, Flora would close her eyes and dream of Elijah. She remembered the warmth of his presence, the way he'd sit beside her as they talked about everything and nothing. She thought of the soft touch of his hand on hers, the way he'd laugh with her, as if they were two old souls who understood one another better than anyone else. But there was a part of Flora that yearned for something more, a life where Elijah could be real, where she didn't have to hide her love for him. One day, after a particularly grueling week of exams, Flora found herself wandering through the quiet university library. She was exhausted and overwhelmed, her thoughts clouded with doubts and confusion. She pulled a book off the shelf, but her fingers hovered over the pages, not really able to focus on the words. "Elijah, where are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. The air seemed to shift and suddenly she felt him beside her. His presence was familiar, like a breeze on a hot day. "I'm here, Flora," Elijah said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm always here." Flora closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the shelves. "I don't know how to do this anymore, Elijah. I feel like I'm living two lives, one with you and one with everyone else. And none of them feel real." Elijah's voice was filled with tenderness. "What would make you feel real, Flora?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just want to be with you. I don't want to hide it anymore." For a long moment there was silence. Then Elijah's words came, soft but full of emotion. "What if we didn't have to hide it? What if we could be together even if no one else understood?" Flora's heart skipped a beat. "But how?" "Love doesn't need to be understood," he said gently. "Love just needs to be felt." Flora's eyes filled with tears as she realized the truth of his words. She didn't need the world's approval to love him. He was her heart's truth, her companion in a world that often felt cold and unwelcoming. "Then let's be together," Flora whispered. "I don't care what anyone else thinks." Elijah's voice came, filled with warmth. "I've always been with you, Flora. I'll always be with you." That night, as Flora lay in her bed, she made a decision. She would no longer hide her love for Elijah. She didn't care about the world's judgment or the doubts of others. She had found something that was real, something that transcended the boundaries of life and death. He loved Elijah, and that was enough. The next morning, Flora woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer going to hide. No more pretending. She was going to live her truth no matter the cost. And as the days passed, Flora's feelings for Elijah only deepened. They shared late-night conversations about everything and nothing. He was always there, a constant in her life, a source of love and comfort. She began to imagine a future with him, one where they could live together side by side, in a world where love wasn't bound by the limits of the visible and invisible. But there was one thing Flora needed to know before she could fully embrace this future. Was Elijah real in the way that she understood it? Was he truly a ghost trapped between worlds, or was he something more? As she sat in her room late one evening, contemplating the nature of her love, Elijah's voice broke through her thoughts as soft as ever. "You know, Flora, I've been thinking." Flora turned toward the window, her heart racing. "What about?" "I think it's time," Elijah said, his voice filled with emotion. "Time for us to take a step forward together." Flora's heart pounded in her chest. What do you mean? Elijah, are you asking me to marry you? The silence that followed was filled with a quiet intensity, and then Elijah's voice came, clear and certain. Yes. Flora's heart soared. For the first time in her life, everything felt right. She was no longer living in the shadows of doubt and fear. She was ready to embrace a future with Elijah no matter the consequences. Flora could hardly contain her excitement as the day of her wedding approached. For years she had lived in a world of secrecy, hiding her love for Elijah from the prying eyes of others. But now she was ready to share her truth with the world, to show everyone that true love wasn't bound by the visible or the tangible. The Barrett estate, as magnificent as ever, was transformed into a wedding venue. Its golden chandeliers twinkled, casting soft light over the grand ballroom where friends and family had gathered. But Flora's heart beat only for one person, the man she had loved since she was a little girl. Are you ready? Her mother asked, smoothing down the delicate fabric of Flora's gown, a stunning white dress with intricate lace details that shimmered as she moved. Flora nodded, her smile as bright as the morning sun. I'm ready, she said, though her mind was far from the bridal preparations. She wasn't nervous about the ceremony itself but about what would come next. The world would soon see her as she truly was, and Flora was anxious to see how they would react. Would they understand? Would they believe her? Her father, standing nearby, gave her a tight hug, his stern face softened by love. I'm proud of you, Flora. No matter what happens, this is your moment. Make it yours. She smiled up at him, squeezing his hand. Thank you, Papa. The moment had arrived. Flora walked down the grand staircase of the Barrett mansion, her heart racing as the music began to play softly in the background. Guests, dressed in their finest, turned to watch her descent, their eyes filled with curiosity and admiration. Flora's gaze was fixed ahead at the empty space in front of the altar. Elijah was already there, waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she imagined him standing there, his gentle eyes meeting hers. Despite the fact that no one else could see him, Flora knew he was right there, waiting for her. She could feel him, his presence so strong and real that it was as if he were standing beside her, his hand resting in hers. As she reached the altar, Flora turned to face the guests. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. They saw no groom, only Flora in her wedding dress, standing alone. But Flora wasn't alone. Elijah's voice, soft and loving, whispered to her, just loud enough for her to hear. I'm here, Flora. Always. Her eyes closed for a moment, letting his words fill her heart. The love they shared wasn't bound by the rules of the living or the dead, it simply existed, and that was all that mattered. The ceremony proceeded as it should, though there were moments of confusion. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, wondering why Flora seemed to be responding to someone they couldn't see. The officiant, a close family friend, hesitated briefly but carried on, sensing Flora's determination and the serenity in her eyes. When it was time for the vows, Flora took a deep breath. Elijah, she began, her voice steady and clear, I've loved you since I was a little girl. And though the world may not understand, I know in my heart that our love is real. I've chosen you and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. Her words filled the room, but they only echoed in the silence around her. No one could hear Elijah's response, but Flora felt it, his love as real and tangible as her own. I love you, Flora, he whispered, though only she could hear it. And I promise to be with you always. Flora smiled, her heart soaring. I do, came the echo of Elijah's voice, carried on the wind as if his very soul was reaching out to her, binding their hearts together in a way that no one else could understand. The moment the ceremony ended, Flora was enveloped in applause, but it was not for the groom they clapped for her, the radiant bride, standing proudly in a world where her love was seen only by her. Her guests were baffled. Some were uncomfortable, some whispered, but no one dared question her. And Flora didn't care. She had Elijah by her side, and that was all that mattered. The reception was a grand affair, with flowers in every corner, laughter filling the air and champagne flowing freely. The guests danced, ate, and celebrated, but there was an unspoken tension in the room. They were celebrating Flora's happiness, but they couldn't fully understand it. As Flora and Elijah stood together in the center of the room, she felt an odd sense of peace wash over her. It didn't matter that others couldn't see him. In that moment she was surrounded by love that transcended the physical world. Love that didn't need to be seen to be felt. As the night wore on, something extraordinary began to happen. It started with a shift in the air. A slight change, almost imperceptible but noticeable to Flora. The temperature dropped just a little, and then for the first time she felt something in energy, a presence that made her gasp. "Elijah," she whispered, her heart racing. "Yes," came his voice, stronger now, more distinct. And then, to her amazement, she saw him. Elijah stood before her, his figure now fully visible to everyone in the room. His once ethereal form had solidified, his features clear and sharp. He was tall, with dark hair and kind eyes, his face filled with love and warmth. The room went silent as the guests stared in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. But Flora couldn't tear her eyes away from Elijah. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Elijah." He smiled at her, his eyes filled with joy. "I'm real, Flora. I'm here just like I promised." The guests gasped in awe and fear. Some backed away, unsure of what they were witnessing, while others stood frozen in place. The impossible had become real. Elijah had materialized, and the world couldn't deny it any longer. Flora's heart soared as she reached out to Elijah, her hand trembling. "You're here," she whispered, the words filled with wonder and disbelief. He took her hand, and for the first time she felt the warmth of his skin. His presence was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a reality. Flora and Elijah stood together, a symbol of love that defied the boundaries of life and death. In that moment the world was changed. No longer would anyone doubt the power of their love. The weeks following Flora's wedding were filled with wonder and disbelief. Elijah, once a ghostly figure only visible to Flora, now walked alongside her in the world of the living. His presence became a sensation, an inexplicable event that captured the attention of the media, the scientific community, and even the spiritual world. At first people were afraid. Some viewed Elijah's sudden materialization as an omen, a supernatural event that bent the rules of nature. Others whispered that Flora had somehow summoned him from the afterlife, that her love had bridged a gap between the living and the dead. But Flora didn't care about their theories or fears. All that mattered was that Elijah was there with her as he had always been. Together they began to navigate a new world, one where their love was real and tangible. Elijah adjusted to the physical world in ways that were both wondrous and awkward. He had to learn how to touch things again, how to hold Flora's hand, how to feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. The first time they walked through the city together, people stared. Some gawked in amazement, others looked on with fear. But Flora and Elijah walked hand in hand, smiling as if they had always belonged to each other. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" Flora asked one evening as she and Elijah sat together on a park bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I don't think they need to," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "They don't have to understand us. We understand each other, and that's enough." Flora's heart swelled with love. "You're right. I've spent so much of my life wondering if I was crazy, if I was alone in this world. But I never was. I had you." Elijah smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "And you'll always have me, Flora. Always." But even as Flora reveled in the joy of being with Elijah, the world around them began to change. Some people accepted Elijah's presence with awe, as if they had witnessed a miracle. Others, however, began to question the nature of his existence. Scientists tried to study him, skeptics called it a hoax, and a few even claimed that Flora had somehow invented the whole thing. The world was divided, torn between belief and disbelief, wonder and fear. One evening, Flora was invited to speak at a prestigious conference on the supernatural, where experts from around the world had gathered to discuss what they believed was the most extraordinary event in modern history: Elijah's return from the beyond. As Flora walked onto the stage, her heart pounded in her chest. She had been asked to explain Elijah's story, to prove that their love was real. But she knew there were no words that could convince them. The truth of their love was something that could never be measured by science or logic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Flora began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I stand before you today not as a scientist or a scholar, but as a woman who loves. Elijah is not a ghost, nor is he an illusion. He is the person I love, and he has always been real to me. Our love is not bound by time or space. It is simply love." The room fell silent. The audience, a sea of skeptics and believers alike, stared at her in disbelief. But Flora didn't back down. She knew that love didn't need to be proven to anyone but the two people who shared it. As the conference ended, Flora and Elijah walked together into the night, hand in hand. "Do you think they understood?" Flora asked softly. Elijah's voice was gentle. "Some did. Some didn't. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we understand each other." Days turned into weeks, and Flora's life slowly began to settle into a new routine. She and Elijah spent their days exploring the world, living a life full of joy, adventure, and love. They traveled to places Flora had only dreamed of, from the ancient streets of Paris to the sun-kissed beaches of Bali. Every moment felt like a gift, a reminder that life was meant to be lived with love and passion. But even as they built a life together, Flora couldn't ignore the quiet voice in her heart that asked, "What comes next?" Flora had always known that Elijah was bound by forces beyond their control. His presence in the world was a miracle, a testament to the power of love that could defy the very laws of nature. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their time together might not last forever. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their luxurious apartment overlooking the city, Flora turned to Elijah, her heart heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Is this permanent?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Will you always be here with me?" Elijah looked at her, his gaze filled with understanding. "I don't know, Flora. But what I do know is that no matter how long we have, I will make every moment count. I will love you for as long as I can." Tears filled Flora's eyes as she reached out to touch his face. "I love you so much, Elijah. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he whispered, taking her hand. "Not for a moment." And then something miraculous happened. As Flora and Elijah held each other, surrounded by the warmth of their love, something shifted in the air, a quiet, gentle change. For the first time, Flora could feel Elijah's presence shift from the ethereal to something more solid, more real. It was as if the invisible bond that had once held him between worlds had finally snapped, allowing him to exist fully in the world of the living. Flora gasped, feeling the reality of his touch in a way she had never felt before. "Elijah," she whispered, her heart racing. "I'm here," he said, his voice full of certainty. "I'm here and I will be with you forever." And in that moment, Flora knew that their love had transcended everything: time, space, even life and death. Together they had defied the impossible, and nothing could ever separate them. Flora and Elijah's love was not a fleeting dream, nor a story to be whispered in the dark. It was real. It was tangible. And it was everlasting. They had proven that love, true love, could never be bound by the limitations of the world. And together they would face whatever came next, knowing that no force could ever tear them apart.